Hey guys, this is Brady. It's good to see y'all. We are starting off a new week here. We've got a lot of ground to cover. We're looking at a changing nation, the United States as a world power, World War I, normalcy and depression, World War II, then finishing up with the United Nations and the Cold War. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Come over here and share my screen. So a changing nation. You got several vocabulary. Again, check out Quizlet. I've got all the vocabulary from this unit of Initia in there so you can help study for your test when the time comes for it. So we have corporation, just the merger of several businesses into one. Depression, a serious and widespread reduction of business activity. Isolationism, a national policy of not participating in the political or economic relations of other countries. And stockholder, one who invests money in a company or a corporation. Our early industrial pursuits in the United States depended on the availability of water power. Factories had to be built near rivers and streams where water wheels could harness the energy of falling water. With the invention of the steam engine, the factories can move away from water sources to any location that had wood or coal as a source of energy. A new boost came with the discovery of oil. A couple of different inventions and their inventors to look at. The transatlantic cable with Cyrus Field. Telephone, Alexander Graham Bell. Experimented with electricity, Benjamin Franklin. Invented the light bulb, Thomas Edison. Used the assembly line, Henry Ford. Invented the airplane, the Wright brothers, and then invented the reaper, Cyrus McCormick. Benjamin Franklin had experimented with electricity but found no practical way to harness this energy. Thomas Edison led in inventing many machines that used electricity. One of the earliest successful cars was Henry Ford's Model T Ford. Ford's new process, the assembly line, added to the earlier idea of mass production. On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers left the ground in unmistakable motor-driven flight. Telegraph, the transcontinental railroad, and the transatlantic cable made for more effective communication and transportation. Consumer demand for products soon required businesses that were able to finance and to manage large-scale productive systems. The corporation was the answer. Now, as we're going through all of this, if you need more time, feel free to pause the video so you can finish out your notes, okay? Investors, called stockholders, contributed money to build a corporation and they shared in the profits or losses. An abundant supply of natural resources, technical knowledge, and skilled labor led to the rapid growth of big corporations. The early benefits of corporations were lower prices per unit, higher standard of living, and improved economy. Eventually, labor unions were formed. Thinking that a share of the company's profit should go to the laborers, the unions pushed for shorter working hours, higher pay, and more humane working conditions. The move to the cities caused crowded living, dependency on money for food and clothing, and little incentive to work harder. All right, so let's look at a recap of all this. The steady progress of industry in the United States was possible because of new sources of energy, allowed industry to develop. Man's creative mind developed methods to increase production, and improved methods of transportation and communication were developed. So that is all for a changing nation. Now we're at the United States as a world power. Again, we've got a couple of vocabulary words. Check out the Quizlet page. Intervention, which is interference by one nation in the affairs of another, and protectorate, a weak country under the protection and partial control of a strong country. Among the moves in the United States made to expand its territory in the 1800s was its purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million. Secretary of State William H. Seward was ridiculed for his purchase of what opponents called Seward's folly. Alaska, however, has proven to be one of America's best investments. The Monroe Doctrine increasingly involved the United States in Western Hemisphere affairs. In 1898, the country went to war with Spain over Cuba. The Cuban people were weary of Spanish rule in that country where the United States businessmen had large investments. President William McKinley sent the battleship Maine to Havana where it blew up and took 260 American lives. People in the U.S. blamed Spain, and the result was the Spanish-American War. The war lasted through the summer of 1898 and ended in victory for the United States. Cuba won independence from Spain, and Spain ceded Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands to the United States. Also in 1898, the U.S. annexed the Hawaiian Islands. Cuba had been plagued by yellow fever. Walter Reed and Colonel William Jorge from the United States isolated the mosquito that carried yellow fever. Control of breeding places and strict sanitation soon brought the disease in Cuba under control. When the United States acquired possessions in the Pacific, a need for a shorter water route was evident. President Theodore Roosevelt arranged for the building of a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. The greatest obstacle to the project was diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. Colonel Jorge was called in to end yellow fever and malaria in Panama, and in 1907, Roosevelt placed Colonel George Gathalis in charge of the project. In 1914, the Panama Canal, one of the world's greatest engineering feats, linked the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The distance between New York and San Francisco was shortened by 8,000 miles. In 1917, the U.S. entered World War I following Germany's decision to use submarines in attacking and sinking neutral ships. The U.S. wanted to make the world safe for democracy. Then in 1918, the end of World War I, U.S. did not join the League of Nations despite it being the idea of President Woodrow Wilson. In 1929, the stock market crashed, startling many Americans and beginning the Great Depression. President Herbert Hoover believed that economic conditions would correct themselves if businesses were left alone. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal was a promise to end the Depression. 1939, World War II began when Germany invaded Poland. The U.S. chose to remain neutral. In 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, and the U.S. entered a powerful coalition that brought victory in World War II. All right, so now the last part of all that was kind of a sums up what we're going to see here in World War I and the slides after that, okay? So we're looking at World War I now, vocabulary. We only have one this time. It's armistice, which is a temporary peace or truce. A major cause of World War I was nationalism, an intense national pride that led to rivalry for trade at home and colonies overseas. European nations fought for Africa in its areas rich in natural resources. In the Far East, Japan and Russia went to war over possession of Manchuria. Now, when we're looking at ignition, it only covers nationalism as one of the causes for World War I. There's actually four main causes of World War I. And if you look at it, it's an acronym for MAIN, M-A-I-N. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Militarism is the arms race, getting as many arms, guns, and munitions as you possibly can. Alliances are, again, groups together, different countries coming together to join to make these alliances. Imperialism is taking over as much territory as you can. And then nationalism is pride in your country. So all of this contributed to World War I. Out of these national rivalries grew an arms race between the European nations. Based on principles introduced in Prussia, countries adopted conscription, a system of military reserves, and the general staff. Tensions grew as the arms race intensified. You had the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente, England, France, and Russia. When an assassin shot Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary on June 28, 1914, these alliances went into action and led to the First World War. Germany raised the war by marching across neutral Germany into France. France's counterattack soon brought the war on the Western Front to a stalemate. In the east, Germany attacked Russia and met with encouraging initial success. Under President Woodrow Wilson, the United States at first hoped to remain non-involved in the European War. However, the sinking of ships, including the Lusitania, with U.S. citizens aboard, became intolerable, and the United States declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917. Hoping to win the war before American troops could arrive, Germany launched a huge offensive in 1918. The Russian Revolution that took Russia out of the war and freed Germany to fight with full forces in the West aided Germany's position. In the fighting, the British tank, the German submarine, and the U.S. airplane were used for the first time, adding to the high losses in men. German resistance dropped after the United States supported counterattack. Weary of years of war, deserted by its allies, and threatened by the invasion of its homeland, Germany signed an armistice on November 11, 1918. Before the war ended, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States prepared his 14 points for a fair peace. After the war, however, Allied leaders opposed the Wilson plan because it was not harsh enough. They wanted Germany, the prime aggressor in the war, to be severely punished by being disarmed and forced to pay in money for the damage it had caused. Germany was stunned by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles that followed. However, it had no choice but to sign. The terms of the Versailles Treaty, particularly the reparations Germany was ordered to pay, laid the groundwork for the Second World War a few years later. Although he felt it dealt too harshly with Germany, President Wilson signed the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty did contain his proposal for a world peace organization called the League of Nations. The League was established to maintain international relations, to limit weapons buildup, and to settle disagreements in a peaceful way. The United States Congress, fearing the League would involve the country in more foreign disputes, rejected it. This rejection weakened the League of Nations in later years when it would most be needed. All right, so that's the end of World War I. So now we're going to take a look at normalcy and depression, talking specifically with the Great Depression. So our vocabulary: depression is a serious and widespread reduction of business activity. The election of Warren G. Harding in 1920 ushered in an era of normalcy and conservatism in the United States. The 1920s brought prosperity to the country. Non-involvement in world affairs and a strong mood towards disarmament marked the era. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed in 1928 by 15 nations, which agreed to settle disputes by means other than war. In 1920, the 18th Amendment made the buying and selling of alcohol illegal. Harding's administration is characterized by a decrease in government spending, a lowering of taxes, and the government wrapped by scandals such as the Teapot Dome scandal, which involved the illegal leasing of federal oil reserves. Harding's presidency ended with his death in 1923. He was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, who did not provide strong leadership. On October 29, 1929, the stock market collapsed, plunging the United States into the Great Depression. Causes of the Depression include an overabundance of agricultural products that drove down prices, excessive credit buying, and too many goods for which there were no buyers. Depression left millions of people jobless and penniless. Many people lost everything they owned. Farmers were especially hard hit by the Great Depression. Many had gone into debt to buy machinery and land and now could not make their payments. Low crop prices just made matters worse. In addition, a massive drought took place in 1931 and 1932 in the Midwest and the South, creating a dust bowl where few crops could grow. President Herbert Hoover did little to halt the Depression, believing private businesses would eventually provide relief. He thought the economic conditions would correct themselves if businesses were left alone. His successor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, backed many government relief programs to end the Depression. Through Roosevelt's vigorous program known as the New Deal, the United States was on its way out of the Depression by the end of the 1930s. Paradoxically, the country's chances for economic recovery were improved by the possibility of war. All right, so that's got us through the Depression. Now we're going to look at World War II. Our vocabulary for World War II is a dictator, a person who, without any claim through inheritance or free election, seizes control of a government. Partly because of the high reparation payments it was forced to make for its part in the war, talking about World War I, Germany's economy collapsed in 1923. When the World Depression struck in the 1930s, Germany saw a way out by rearming, meaning selling arms, building up a military. Several nations soon found outlets for their aggressive designs. In 1935, Italy, under its dictator Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia. The League of Nations, formed after World War I to prevent such attacks, could do nothing. They didn't have the power to prevent those attacks. The Germans, under Adolf Hitler, then moved into the Rhineland, and no nation moved to stop them. Hitler threatened war on Austria, and Austria came under German control. Hitler then took over Czechoslovakia with the consent of England and France, who wished to avoid war. So basically, just to keep from going to war, England and France was just giving more and more territory to the Germans and to Adolf Hitler. The beginning of World War II in Europe was brought on by Hitler's attack on Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany. By 1942, the German war machine had conquered most of Europe. Germany controlled much of North Africa and was about to attack the Soviet Union in spite of a non-aggression treaty with them. The German invasion of the Soviet Union was its first defeat and the turning point of the war. The terrible Russian winter took its toll and it stopped the German advance. Trained to fight in snow and cold, the Soviets counterattacked and drove the Germans back. Moreover, in 1941, the United States had joined the war against Germany and its allies. Gradually, the Allies drove the Germans from North Africa and defeated them in Italy. On June 6, 1944, a combined Allied invasion of France took place in Normandy. It was the largest invasion of its kind in history. Eventually, the Allies drove into Germany itself, and Berlin was surrendered to the Soviets on May 2, 1945. On May 8, 1945 was known as VE Day, the day of victory for the Allied powers in Europe. The Japanese made a deadly surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941. On December 8th, Congress declared war on Japan, and the United States thus found itself in a two-front war, one in Europe, one in the Pacific. Fighting alone in the Pacific, the Americans decided on a policy of island hopping. Under General Douglas MacArthur, the United States forces captured islands in the Solomon, Gilbert, Marshall, and Mariana Islands. Bloody battles were fought over islands with names like Tarawa, Guadalcanal, excuse me, I can't pronounce these names, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima, as the United States fought its way over closer to Japan. Finally, instead of a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland, President Harry S. Truman ordered the first atomic bomb used in war to be dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, on August 6, 1945. A second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. The Japanese surrendered on September 2, 1945, and World War II ended. All right, so that brings us to the end of World War II. Again, if you need some more time to take the notes, just pause it, and then you can go on, start it whenever you're ready. So now we're going to look at the United Nations and the Cold War. Your vocabulary is Detente, which is the easing of strained relations, especially between nations or political groups, and subversion, the act or process of overthrowing. All right, the League of Nations had been established after World War I to prevent another war. After World War II, the world tried again to form a peacekeeping organization by forming the United Nations. The United Nations Charter became effective on October 24, 1945. The main body of the United Nations is its General Assembly, composed of delegates from all members nations, and creates a forum for discussion. The Security Council is the action arm of the United Nations. It has the authority to maintain peace, to settle disputes, and to stop aggression by military means. United Nations Secretariat is composed of clerical and administrative workers. The UN International Court is made up of 15 judges that settle disputes but have no enforcement authority. All right, so the Cold War begins. The Cold War began after World War II between communist nations and democratic nations to prevent the spread of communism. President Harry Truman made the first move to contain the communists after World War II. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the Berlin Airlift and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, called NATO, all helped to stop communist expansion in Europe. The Organization of American States and Point 4 aid helped to check communist subversion in Latin America, so it kept communists from being able to overthrow governments in Latin America. The U.S. was unable to do anything to stop the takeover of China without resulting to all-out war. However, in the Far East, the communists were halted by UN actions in Korea, known as the Korean War or the Korean conflict. During President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration, no lasting reduction of Cold War tension was made. The Soviet Union launched the first orbiting spacecraft, Sputnik. Meanwhile, the rise to power of a pro-communist government in Cuba brought the Cold War still closer to America. President Richard M. Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, changed the diplomatic approach of the U.S. towards communism by taking away from the Cold War policy of containment to the diplomacy of realism, basically meaning they're not going to be able to contain it, and if they left it, be real about it, that is there, just leave it, it'd be fine. For the most part, it worked. It ended up taking care of itself. But this ended the American involvement in the Vietnam conflict. This period of detente, or limited cooperation, began in the 1970s and continued after the fall of communism. In the mid-1980s, a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, reformed/changed Soviet policies, began the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. All right, so that is all I've got for you. That's the end. I appreciate y'all taking the time to watch the video, and I will see y'all tomorrow at 2 o'clock for our Zoom call, and I appreciate y'all and have a good week. Thanks.